At November 22nd, 1944, Leyte, Philippines, the ridge is on fire. Private First Class James Decker is flat against volcanic rock, and 14 Japanese spotters are somewhere above him. He knows this because he counted the muzzle flashes before his unit died around him. 14 positions. 14 men who have been calling artillery down on American soldiers for 11 days straight, directing fire that has killed more than 200 men in the 307th Infantry Regiment alone. He has 4 rounds left in his M1 Garand, 1 full clip for the .45 on his hip, and in his left hand, pressing into the sharp edges of his palm until he bleeds, he holds 8 jagged shards of broken mirror. This is what he's been banned from using. 3 weeks earlier, his commanding officer, Captain Harold Morse, stood in front of the platoon and called the mirror technique an unauthorized field modification with unacceptable risk of friendly fire confusion. He ordered Decker to never use it again. Signed the order in writing. Handed it over personally, as if a sheet of paper could contain what James Decker had already understood about light and angles and the geometry of an enemy's attention. Decker folded that order into his breast pocket, right behind the letter to his sister. He never threw either of them away. But right now, alone on Hill 380, with his unit gone, and 200 American soldiers dying somewhere below him, because these spotters will not stop calling fire, he is about to disobey a direct command. And because the alternative is dying on this rock, while 14 men he can't see call in the rounds that kill him. The sun sits at a 7-degree angle behind his right shoulder. He knows exactly what these mirror shards will do when he angles them into the light. He has been calculating it for 3 days. What happens in the next 4 minutes will be studied, quietly, without official acknowledgement, by Army intelligence officers for the rest of the Pacific campaign. The Japanese soldiers who survived this morning will spend 40 years trying to explain what they witnessed. Some things cannot be explained. Some men cannot be calculated. But we are going to try. Let's go back to the beginning. James Decker was born on the 14th of March, 1921, in Terre Haute, Indiana. His father patched blacktop for the Indiana State Highway Department in the summer and went half hungry in the winters when the work dried up. His mother canned everything: tomatoes, peaches, lima beans, whatever the backyard produced, because you never knew when the jar would be all that was left. He grew up with 2 things: a sister named Helen, 4 years younger and smarter than anyone else in the county, and an almost painful ability to notice what other people missed. His 8th grade teacher, Mrs. Eileen Coury, wrote in his permanent record, "James sees the geometry in things." She meant it as a compliment. She wasn't entirely sure what it meant, but it was accurate. He noticed angles, light sources, the way shadows shifted when wind hit tall grass from the northwest. And he was the kind of boy who knew which way a man was walking before he turned the corner, not from sound, but from watching how the light changed on the wall behind him. His mind was a surveyor's instrument, dressed in worn-out clothes. He enlisted on December 8th, 1941, the morning after Pearl Harbor. He walked to the recruiting office in his work boots because his good shoes had a hole in the right sole and he didn't want to make a bad impression. His platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Lou Garza, described Decker to a Stars and Stripes correspondent in the summer of 1944 as the quietest man I have ever seen move through jungle. He doesn't disturb the air when he walks. I have never seen that in a human being before. The men in his squad called him the Surveyor, not because he was formal or stiff, and because he was always studying terrain, like he was calculating something that no one else had thought to calculate yet. Distances, angles, the position of the sun relative to an enemy's likely sight lines. Half the time, they figured he was daydreaming. He wasn't. The night before the assault on Hill 380, he sat alone in the dark and wrote Helen a letter. He sealed it with the back of his thumb. He slid it into his breast pocket, directly behind Captain Morse's signed order banning the mirror trick. 2 pieces of paper. One that told him what he couldn't do. One that told him why he had to do everything. The letter contained a single sentence: "I'm keeping my promise." No one in his unit knew what promise it meant. Helen knew. He had told her the night before he shipped out, standing in the kitchen at 3 a.m., eating cold beans from the can while she pretended to be asleep in the next room. "I'm coming home." He put those 2 pieces of paper in his pocket and walked into the dark toward a ridge his battalion had failed to take 4 times. This video gives you the story, but the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details, forgotten heroes, full tactical breakdowns, stories that'll hit you harder than this one. Free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the description. First issue is already waiting for you. Hill 380. That was what the U.S. Army called it. The Japanese 1st Division had a different name for it, something that translates roughly as the place that does not fall. They were not being poetic. They were being accurate. In the 11 days before Decker's assault, and the 307th Infantry Regiment had attempted to take Hill 384 times. 4 coordinated attacks, each with full company strength, artillery support, and coordinated air. The Hill stopped all of them, every single time. The position was extraordinary, and it had not become extraordinary by accident. The Japanese 1st Division had spent months constructing a layered observation network across the ridgeline. 14 forward observation posts dug into the volcanic rock and covered with reinforced coconut log overhead protection that laughed at everything except a direct artillery hit. The spotters in those posts had direct line of sight to every major American supply route, every field hospital position, and every artillery emplacement in the 77th Division's sector. They had been directing fire with a precision that U.S. Army intelligence officers later described in classified after-action documents declassified in 1975 as surgical and devastating. In 11 days, those 14 spotters called in fire that killed 211 American soldiers and wounded 340 more. Not from rifles, not from bayonets, from telephones and radios directing Japanese artillery sitting safe and invisible 4 miles to the north. They were not warriors in the field. They were the eyes behind the killing, and as long as they held Hill 380, those eyes never closed. The position's defense fell to Sergeant Major Kenji Okamoto, a 14-year Imperial Japanese Army veteran who had fought in China, Malaya, and Guadalcanal. He had never lost a position he was ordered to hold. His 41 defenders were not raw conscripts pulled from the home islands. They were survivors, men who had clawed their way from beach to jungle to ridgeline across 2 years of Pacific fighting and were still standing. They had fortified Hill 380 with interlocking fields of fire covering every natural approach, trip-wire early warning systems in the brush below the first terrace, and pre-registered mortar coordinates mapped for every conceivable attack vector. If you studied this position from below, as the 307th officers had done 4 times, it looked like what it was, near impregnable. On the morning of November 22nd, 1944, the 77th Division's intelligence officer briefed Decker's 12-man platoon in a coconut grove half a mile from the base of the ridge. He placed enemy strength at 18 defenders. He described the eastern approach as likely passable with covering fire. He marked 2 primary observation posts on the map. He was wrong on every count. The platoon moved out at 0530. Decker was 3rd in the file, behind Lieutenant Thomas Waverly and Corporal Bill Shaughnessy. By the time they reached the base of the ridge, there were 9 of them, 3 men caught by a pre-registered mortar barrage on the eastern approach, a route the intelligence map had colored green. They didn't know the position had been reinforced overnight. Okamoto had moved 9 additional men up the ridge under cover of darkness, raising his force from 32 to 41. And as the platoon pushed up toward the ridge, the brush exploded. Not 2 observation posts, 14. The entire ridgeline lit up with coordinated fire from positions that shouldn't have existed, and what had been a 12-man assault became a catastrophe in 60 seconds. Then the radio crackled. All elements, this is regiment. New orders. Withdraw immediately to phase line Delta. Repeat, withdraw to phase line Delta. Acknowledge. Lieutenant Waverly grabbed Decker's arm. He had 3 seconds to make a decision. The men behind them were already moving back down the slope. Waverly was already turning. He looked at Decker. Decker looked up the ridge. 41 Japanese soldiers were between him and 14 spotters who would call fire on American positions every hour of every day until someone made them stop. Waverly went down. Decker went up. He wasn't being heroic yet. He was being geometric, and he was too deep in the angle, too committed to the calculation he had been running for 72 hours to stop what his feet were already doing. He was alone. 2 full Garand clips, 2 partials, 1.45 pistol with a full magazine, no water, a field bandage still folded in its original paper, a breast pocket with 2 pieces of paper in it, and in his right jacket pocket, wrapped in a rag to keep them from clinking, 8 jagged shards of broken mirror he'd been collecting since he first studied this ridgeline 3 days earlier and started doing mathematics. 1 hill, 41 defenders, 14 spotters. The mission was still active. He moved like water finding a crack in stone, not charging, not running. Low against the earth. Direction changing every 15 meters. A body using dead ground the Japanese mapping hadn't fully accounted for. A shallow drainage channel carved by monsoon rains that sat outside the pre-registered mortar coordinates by just enough to matter. A man who noticed the geometry in things. Above him, Sergeant Major Okamoto's voice cut across the ridge in clipped professional commands. In post-war interrogation transcripts, A surviving defender described Okamoto's demeanor in those first minutes as entirely calm. He had repelled 4 American assaults. He knew what the American army sounded like coming up a hill, the weight of it, the rhythm of coordinated fire, the way artillery prep always preceded the infantry push. He had a mental model of an American attack that had been confirmed and refined by 4 consecutive victories, and he knew this terrain the way a craftsman knows his tools. He redirected 2 positions to cover the drainage channel. He had anticipated its use. His men moved with the clean precision of soldiers who had rehearsed this response against this terrain in anticipation of exactly this moment. Decker heard them shifting. He stopped moving. He pressed himself into the earth and let 5 full minutes pass while 2 Japanese positions settled into their new firing angles 40 meters above him. He counted the time. He watched the light. Then he moved left, off the drainage channel, into open ground. That was when Okamoto's trap sprang. The sound arrived before the rounds did. A sustained burst from a Type 99 light machine gun that had been silent through all 4 previous assaults, positioned in a fold of rock 20 meters to Decker's right, that read as dead ground from the base of the ridge, but was not. A flanking position, sighted specifically for the moment, an attacker left the drainage channel and stepped into the open. Okamoto had known someone would try exactly that. He had a trained crew waiting there for 11 days. Decker hit the ground the same instant the first burst cut the air where his sternum had been. He was already rolling, using the slope, using the downhill grade as a conveyor belt, before any conscious decision had been made. 3 seconds of pure motion, with no thought in it, just the body executing what 18 months of infantry training had carved into reflex. He rolled into a rock depression he hadn't mapped, a dip in the volcanic surface 6 inches deep, and in the next burst sent sparks off the stone 6 inches above his face. The rounds were close enough that he felt the displaced air against his cheek. He lay completely still. His hands were pressed flat against the rock. They were not shaking, but he was not calm. He was operational. In those seconds, operational was the only thing that mattered. What he did in the next 90 seconds made no tactical sense, until you understand what he had already seen that no one else on that battlefield could see. He reached into his right jacket pocket. His fingers closed around something sharp enough to cut. He didn't move any other part of his body. He pulled out a shard of broken mirror. He did not fire his rifle. He did not draw his .45. He did not throw a grenade, and he lay in a 6-inch depression on a Japanese-held ridgeline with a machine gun crew 20 meters away, and he waited for the sun to move 2 degrees. The sun cleared the eastern ridge at 0618. Decker angled the first shard. 1 flash, 2, 3, each from a slightly different tilt of the wrist, the reflected light jumping between his fingertips and the volcanic rock face in a staggered sequence, creating 3 distinct points of bright light that strobed from positions between 10 and 40 meters apart on the slope to his left. To a trained observer on the ridge above, 3 muzzle flashes, 3 American soldiers firing from the left flank. The flanking machine gun crew pivoted left. The Type 99 opened up on the light source. Every round went into empty volcanic rock. Decker moved right. 8 meters in 4 seconds, 10 meters. He had approximately 12 seconds before the positions on the ridge recalibrated their visual fix on his location. He counted them in his head. On 12, he stopped, pressed into a new fold of rock, pulled a second shard. Above him, the confusion was beginning. Two defenders from Observation Post 7 were shouting to each other. This is documented in the post-war interrogation transcripts. A fire report went up to Okamoto's command post. Contact left flank, estimated 4 to 6 enemy soldiers. The number was wrong by 5, but Okamoto had no way to know that. He redirected 2 additional positions to reinforce the left flank response. There was 1 American soldier on that ridge. He was now 14 meters from where they thought he was. Decker moved again. He worked the geometry like a problem he had already solved on paper. At the first ring of observation posts, 4 positions fell across the next 20 minutes. He worked with the sun and the reflections and the angles of the rock, each shard creating a phantom presence in a place he wasn't while he moved to the place they weren't looking. When a defender at OP3 came out of cover to pursue what he believed was an American soldier caught in the open, Decker put 2 rounds from his Garand into him from 30 meters. The shot was close to his last resort. He had 7 rounds left in the current clip, and 2 full clips remaining after that. He had to be deliberate. He was always deliberate. He was reaching the secondary defensive ring. 8 more positions, clustered tighter, with overlapping sight lines. When he stopped entirely. Below him, I tucked into a natural rock shelter between the ridge's first and second terraces, were 4 people. A Filipino man in his 50s, hollow-cheeked, wearing a field worker's shirt with one sleeve torn away, his arms wrapped around his knees and his eyes very wide. A woman beside him with gray threading through her black hair, absolutely still, in the practiced way of someone who has learned that stillness is armor. And 2 children, a boy of perhaps 8, pressed against the man's left side, and a girl who could not have been older than 5, sitting cross-legged with a dented tin cup held in both hands against her chest like it was a shield. She was looking directly at James Decker. She did not make a sound. Her eyes were the color of dark water. They had survived 4 American assaults and 11 days of continuous artillery fire in this rock shelter, which meant they understood the rules of staying invisible far better than most soldiers did. The girl looked at him for 2 full seconds. Then she looked at the tin cup, then back at him. Decker looked at his planned route through the secondary ring. The faster route, the one that would let him take OP8 and 9 with a diagonal movement up the center, ran directly through the crossfire corridor he needed to create. The reflections from the mirror work would bracket their shelter within 15 meters. 3 of the Japanese positions he still needed to suppress had sight lines that crossed directly over that rock hollow. He could not take the fast route. He looked at the girl. He looked at the rock hollow. So he looked left, at 30 meters of completely open, exposed, unprotected stone face with no drainage channels, no dead ground, no natural cover of any kind. He checked the sun's angle. He pulled 2 shards from his pocket. He arranged them in a precise pattern on the top edge of a flat stone to his right, angling them to catch the sun at a specific bearing he calculated would draw attention to OP-10's left flank. He left them there. Then he began moving left, into the open ground. He took the hard way, because 2 of the children had faces, and 5 Japanese observation posts had sight lines that crossed the fast route. And James Decker had already decided, probably before he consciously said so, that the girl with the tin cup was going home. And he was halfway across the open stone face when a round tore through the right side of his field jacket. He felt the fabric rip, but not the burning, which told him grazing wound and not a penetrating strike. He did not slow down. He reached to cover. He checked the wound. The bullet had taken a shallow channel across the outer edge of his right thigh, enough to bleed seriously, not enough to sever anything structural. He pressed the heel of his hand against it, held for 30 seconds, and let it go. He lost his third Garand clip when he went flat behind a rock, and the magazine bounced over the edge into a crevice 2 feet deep. He could see it. He couldn't reach it. He left it. 2 clips left. 1 in the rifle, 1 on his belt. 7 rounds of .45. A thigh wound. A sun that was now climbing toward high noon and would flatten into a worse angle in 2 hours. And back there, on the exposed stone to his right, the 2 arranged mirror shards were still catching the sun. OP-10 and OP-11. Both had direct sight lines to those shards. They had been looking at them for 20 minutes. He moved to a new position and waited. He did not fire. He did not use the remaining mirror pieces. He arranged nothing else. He sat behind a rock with his hand on his thigh wound, and he waited. And this was the moment. In the interrogation records, across multiple accounts, that the Japanese defenders on the ridgeline began to feel something shift. 3 defenders from OP-10 were in the process of repositioning to engage the signal position they'd identified on the flat stone. The 2 arranged shards, steady and deliberate in the noon light, when Decker moved. He stopped moving at 0741. Not by choice. His right leg had begun to stiffen. The thigh wound was clenching the muscle into a slow, deep ache that was migrating from discomfort into something more structural. He checked the bandage he'd pressed against it and found it soaked through. Not dangerously. He'd seen arterial bleeds and knew what they looked like, and this was not that. But the blood loss was accumulating on top of the exhaustion, and when he tried to push himself upright using his right leg, the leg sent back a message he couldn't argue with. He sat with his back against the rock. He ran inventory. 5 Garand rounds remaining in the current clip. 1 full clip on his belt. 7 rounds of .45. 3 mirror shards still intact in his jacket pocket. And the 2 he'd arranged on the flat stone behind him were still working. He could hear the sporadic fire from OP-10's position as the crew continued to engage what they believed was an American signal element. He drank the last of his water. He ate nothing because there was nothing. The sun had climbed to its high point, and the light was changing, flatter, more direct, less angular. The mirror work depended on oblique light. In 3 hours, the sun's angle would make the shards nearly useless. He had a window. He pressed his palm against the thigh wound until the bleeding slowed. He sat there and listened to the ridge. Above him, he could still hear voices. Not the crisp, controlled commands of the early morning. Something different, tighter. Men calling to each other across positions with a frequency and a pitch that carried a quality he recognized in a visceral, pre-verbal way. The same sound his own unit made when they understood they were losing and couldn't identify why. which was the worst kind of losing, the kind that ate at a man's training from the inside. He thought about Lieutenant Waverly walking back down the slope. He thought about Bill Shaughnessy, who had 2 daughters in Providence, and showed Decker their photographs every time he got a letter. He thought about the 3 men who caught the mortar barrage on the approach route that the intelligence map had colored green. He thought about Captain Morse's order, folded in his breast pocket. He thought about retreating. He thought about it seriously, and the way a rational man sitting on a rock with a leg wound and not enough ammunition should think about retreating. He was one man. The position had 41 defenders when he started. He had neutralized some of them. How many exactly was hard to calculate, but enough remained that the math of direct confrontation did not work in his favor. His right hand found his breast pocket without him consciously sending it there. He felt the shape of the folded papers against his palm through the fabric. Morse's order, Helen's letter. One document told him what the Army said he couldn't do. One document was a sentence he had written to a woman in Terre Haute, who was probably standing in a kitchen right now, canning something, doing the work that needed to be done, and not thinking too hard about where her brother was. It's because thinking too hard about it was the one thing she could not afford. He sat there for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. He counted them. Then he pulled the 3 remaining mirror shards from his pocket, looked at the sun's new angle with the precise attention he had been looking at things his entire life, and figured out something he had not tried yet. Something the 2 arranged shards, still sitting there on the flat stone, still drawing fire and attention from OP-10, were already doing for him without him having planned it. A setup, an anchor, a fixed point that the enemy's attention had been calibrated to. He understood, in that moment, sitting against the rock with his leg bleeding, that he didn't need the sun at the perfect angle. He needed the enemy looking at the wrong place. He started moving again. For the 2 shards he'd arranged on the flat stone had been catching the high sun for 43 minutes. To OP-10 and OP-11, which had direct sight lines to that section of exposed rock, they had read as an American signal element for nearly an hour. A command presence, equipment, something worth targeting and watching. Okamoto had received reports about those reflections at least twice. He was not a man given to recklessness, but he was also a man whose trained perceptual framework had been built around fighting armies, coordinated forces, elements with command structures and signal equipment and logical positions. 3 defenders from OP-10 had repositioned to engage the signal position. This is confirmed in post-war interrogation. They moved 30 meters down the slope toward the flat stone to get a better firing angle, and they were 35 meters from Decker's actual position when he came up over the lip of the rock above OP-10's original location, now almost unmanned, and came in behind them. He cleared OP-10 in 11 seconds. The defenders at their repositioned location heard the shots from behind them and turned. He had already moved. He was 12 meters away when they turned, coming at OP-11 from an angle that required the crew to rotate their Type 99 mount past its mechanical traverse limit. They couldn't bring the gun to bear in time. OP-11 fell at 0858. The sounds of those 2 engagements carried across the ridge. In post-war interrogation, a surviving defender from OP-12, a 23-year-old lance corporal named Hiroshi Tamura, who had served since 1942, described what he heard. Fire from multiple directions, very close, goes very fast. I could not calculate the positions. Sergeant Major Okamoto ordered us to consolidate on the command post. We moved immediately, but we did not understand the direction of the threat. We could not fix the location of any Americans. We could not understand how many there were. There was one American on that ridge. He was moving at 0900, and he was not stopping. He moved, fired, dropped, moved again. 30 meters, 20, 10. The remaining 3 mirror shards were in his left hand as he went. He wasn't using them for illusion anymore. There wasn't time or angle for the deliberate work. He was using them as he moved through positions, pressing them flat and angling them in a single motion to throw a reflection toward wherever he wasn't going next. Not geometry now, instinct. And the mathematics he had calculated for 72 hours had dissolved into something below thought. Light and motion, and the precise coordination of a man whose nervous system understood angles the way other men understood breathing. Positions 12 and 13 fell in 90 seconds. He came at both of them from the direction the 2 arranged shards had trained the defenders to ignore. Sergeant Major Kenji Okamoto was at the command post, the central observation station, the nerve center of the entire network, a position dug 6 feet into the volcanic rock with reinforced walls and a direct telephone line to Japanese artillery 4 miles north, when Decker came over the lip of the rock above him. 14 years of combat. China, Malaya, Guadalcanal. Not one position lost. In post-war interrogation, and conducted by U.S. Army intelligence in December 1944, Okamoto refused to describe the final engagement in tactical detail. He sat in silence for a long time when the interpreter asked him. Then he said only, "I did not expect him from above." The command post fell at 0907. Below the ridge, the Santos family was already moving down the eastern slope. Rodrigo Santos, with Liwanag on his back and the tin cup still in her hand, following the path that had been cleared, because Decker had taken the hard route through the open stone face, the route that took him across 30 meters of exposed ground with a leg wound, specifically because it was the route that opened the eastern descent, without the crossfire that would have made the rock shelter lethal. He had planned that before he took the first step into the open. At 0908, James Decker sat at the captured command post. He looked at the radio equipment, the phones, the maps, the pre-registered fire coordinates for every American position in the 77th Division sector. The tools that had been calling down killing for 11 days. He put his hand against his thigh. He looked at the ridge around him. He looked at the sky. He did not move for 60 seconds. The ridge was quiet. All 14 observation posts silent. The phone to Japanese artillery sat off its hook, its cord hanging. 1 American soldier. 1 M1 Garand, with 2 rounds remaining. 7 spent cartridges from the .45. 8 mirror shards, 3 of them still in his left hand. He set the mirror pieces down on the command post table, next to the artillery fire maps. He pressed his field bandage against his thigh with one hand, but he waited for the army to come find him. The first American soldiers to reach the summit of Hill 380 arrived at 11:34 on November 22, 1944. Platoon Sergeant Roy Abernathy of Charlie Company, 307th Infantry, was the senior NCO in the first element up the ridge. He gave a statement to a 77th Division After Action interviewer 3 days later. He described arriving at the command post and finding, and this is his exact phrasing, something out of a picture nobody painted yet. 14 observation posts neutralized, 31 Japanese dead, 10 prisoners taken alive. The command post intact, maps, radio equipment, fire control charts, the direct phone line to Japanese artillery, all undisturbed. And one private first class from Terre Haute, Indiana, who's sitting at the command table with a soaked field bandage wrapped around his right thigh, drinking from a canteen Abernathy handed him. When Abernathy asked him how many men he'd had with him, Decker said 1. Abernathy asked him to repeat it. The prisoners were processed through Army intelligence interrogation in the days that followed. The interrogating officer, a Captain David Liang of the 77th Division G2 section, fluent in Japanese, later described those sessions in a classified report as unlike any prisoner interrogation I conducted in the Pacific Campaign. When the first prisoner was asked how many Americans had assaulted Hill 380 on the morning of November 22nd, he gave a number. Liang wrote it down. He walked to the next room and asked the second prisoner the same question. He got a different number. He asked all 10, and he received 10 different answers, ranging from 4 Americans to 15. He walked back to the first prisoner and told him, through the interpreter, that a single American soldier had taken the position. The prisoner asked the interpreter to repeat the statement. Then he said, "This cannot be true. We saw fire from many positions." Among themselves, from approximately 700 onward, the Japanese defenders of Hill 380 had given Decker a name. Multiple interrogation transcripts reference it. The interpreters rendered it several ways. The most consistent translation was Kagami no Oni, the mirror demon. The name had not come from his fighting. They had been unable to clearly observe his fighting, which was partially the point. The name came from the moment a defender at OP-10 walked toward the flat stone to engage the signal position, and understood, arriving at the rock, that there was nothing there. 2 pieces of glass, reflecting sunlight, and no American soldier within 40 meters. Something had been making them fire at light. Captain Liang's report notes that one prisoner, Lance Corporal Hiroshi Tamura of OP-12, repeated the phrase Kagami no Oni 3 times in his interview before Liang had it translated. When Liang asked him to explain what he meant, Tamura said, "He was the light. We shot at the light. The light was not him." In 1962, Kenji Okamoto was interviewed by a Japanese military historian compiling oral accounts of the Pacific Campaign. Okamoto was given James Decker's name specifically and asked about him directly, and the historian noted in his publication that Okamoto was quiet for a long time before answering. Then he said, "He saw the ridge from inside the light. None of us could see where the light ended and where he began. This is not something a man is taught. This is something a man is." The Santos family, Rodrigo and Maria, and their children Paulo and Liwanag, gave testimony to a U.S. Army Civil Affairs officer on November 25th, Maria Santos spoke through an interpreter. She said, "He came from the wrong direction to protect us. He made himself more in danger, so that we would be less in danger. He was a soldier who did not know our names." Liwanag Santos still had the tin cup. Private First Class James Decker was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross on January 14, 1945, at a ceremony at 77th Infantry Division Headquarters on Leyte. The citation reads, in part, "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy while serving as a rifleman with the 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division, in action against enemy forces on Leyte, Philippines, on November 22, 1944. Private First Class Decker, upon finding himself isolated from his unit following withdrawal of friendly forces, voluntarily continued the assault against a heavily fortified enemy observation post complex defended by 41 enemy soldiers. Despite sustaining a gunshot wound to the right thigh and being critically low on ammunition, Private First Class Decker neutralized 14 enemy observation posts through a combination of superior marksmanship, tactical ingenuity, and improvised techniques, and captured the position intact with its communications equipment undestroyed. His actions directly eliminated an enemy fire direction capability that had inflicted 551 American casualties over the preceding 11 days. Private First Class Decker's courage, resourcefulness, and complete disregard for his own safety reflect great credit upon himself and are in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Army. It does not mention the mirrors. The Army's official language has no category for what the mirrors were. It calls what Decker did improvised techniques and moves on. He came home to Terre Haute in August of 1945. He went back to the Indiana State Highway Department, like his father. He worked blacktop summers and went half hungry some winters when the work dried up. And he did not speak publicly about Hill 380 for 23 years. In 1968, a journalist from the Indianapolis Star sat down with him for 40 minutes. Most of the interview was about Helen, who had become a school teacher and was, Decker noted with evident satisfaction, still the smartest person in the county. Near the end of the interview, the journalist asked if Decker had ever heard what the Japanese survivors called him. He said he hadn't. The journalist read him the translation, "The Mirror Demon." Decker looked out the window. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They got the mirror part right." The capture of Hill 380 and the elimination of the Japanese fire direction network allowed U.S. Army artillery and supply elements to operate freely in the 77th Division sector for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. The 307th Infantry Regiment's subsequent operations on Leyte were conducted without the systematic directed fire that had been killing American soldiers at a rate of 19 per day. Military historians have estimated that Decker's action on November 22nd directly enabled the subsequent advance that cleared the central Leyte corridor by December 10th. 1 man, 14 positions, 8 pieces of broken mirror. The mathematics of an extraordinary life. He was given wrong intelligence. 18 defenders, they told him. There were 41. The eastern approach was passable, they told him. 3 men died, proving otherwise. He was given a signed, written order in his own breast pocket telling him the one technique that would save his life was banned, unauthorized, a risk he was not permitted to take. His orders changed mid-assault, and his unit retreated. He had no communications, no water, no backup, and a bullet wound in his thigh that would have sent most men back down the hill. He had a weapon with fewer rounds in it than most soldiers go through in a single firefight. He was alone on a ridge that had turned back 4 previous assaults. And in the middle of all of that, inside the most desperate, reduced, isolated moment of the entire mission, there was a 5-year-old girl holding a tin cup. And he looked at her, and he added her name to the list of things that needed to be taken care of. Not because it made the mission easier, because she was there. He finished the mission. He walked back down the hill under his own power. He kept the letter. He kept the order. And he kept both of them in his breast pocket for the rest of the war, and brought them home to Terre Haute. The enemy gave him a name, not because they were weak, because they were good soldiers, professional soldiers, men who had defended that ridgeline through 4 consecutive American assaults and never lost it, and they had encountered something their training, their experience, and their entire framework for understanding warfare could not contain or account for. Kagami no Oni, the mirror demon. What your enemies say about you, when the war is over and there is nothing left but the truth, when they have no reason to honor you except that honoring you is the only honest thing they can do, is the truest measure of who you were on that battlefield. If you are a veteran watching this, you already know the thing I am trying to name. You know the weight that comes back down a hill with you. You know that the DSC citation doesn't touch it, and the homecoming doesn't dissolve it, and working blacktop in the Indiana summer doesn't make it smaller. You carry it the way he carried it, quietly in a breast pocket, behind a letter you wrote before you left that says, "I'm keeping my promise." He kept it. He went home. He stood in the kitchen at 3 a.m. and let Helen pretend to be asleep in the next room. He ate cold beans from a can and did not say a word about any of it, because some things can't be said, and some debts can only be paid in full by the man who owes them. James Decker paid his in full, on a hill that had never fallen, with 8 pieces of broken mirror and the geometry of light. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss these forgotten stories of extraordinary American courage. Who should we tell next? Drop their name in the comments.